No one noticed Sofia when she stopped talking until the very end. This story will deeply affect you. Before we get to the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video, and your comments are really important to me. I'll be waiting for your comments. The day Sofia Morales stopped speaking, nobody noticed. Not the guards, not the other inmates, not the prison psychologist who saw her every Thursday for mandatory sessions. In Irongate Women's Correctional Facility, silence was just another form of survival. And Sofia had been surviving for 7 years. She was 31 years old the night they brought her in. Convicted of voluntary manslaughter. 12 years, eligible for parole in 10. The prosecution had painted her as a cold-blooded killer who'd stabbed her husband 17 times in a jealous rage. The jury had deliberated for 9 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty. Sofia hadn't testified in her own defense. Her court-appointed lawyer had advised against it. Said the prosecution would tear her apart on cross-examination. Said her broken English would make her seem unreliable. Said the photographs of her injuries, the fractured ribs, the cigarette burns, the healed fractures that showed up on x-rays like a roadmap of violence, wouldn't matter because there was no evidence linking them to the night of the killing. So Sofia had sat silent in that courtroom, watching her life collapse like a house of cards. And when they led her away in chains, she'd looked back once at the empty gallery. No family. No friends. No one. In prison, Sofia discovered that silence had a different currency than it did on the outside. Women talked constantly in Irongate. Talking was how you established dominance, how you formed alliances, how you survived. But Sofia didn't talk. She worked in the laundry, 12-hour shifts in 100-degree heat, saying nothing to the other workers. She ate her meals alone in the corner of the cafeteria, eyes down, invisible. She returned to her cell every night and sat on her bunk reading donated paperback novels until lights out. The other inmates left her alone. Some out of respect, most out of confusion. In a place where verbal warfare was constant, where words were weapons and alliances were everything, a woman who refused to engage was incomprehensible. Dangerous? Maybe. Crazy? Probably. Only one person seemed to understand Sofia's silence. Officer Rachel Chen had been working at Irongate for 11 years. She'd seen every kind of inmate. The violent ones who couldn't adapt to confinement. The manipulative ones who played games with guards and inmates alike. The broken ones who'd given up hope. The hardened ones who'd transformed themselves into something unrecognizable. Sofia was none of these things. Sofia was present but absent. There but not there. She followed every rule with precision. Never caused trouble. Never asked for anything. And somehow, that very compliance made Rachel uneasy. It was during a random cell inspection that Rachel first noticed something off. Sofia's cell was immaculate. Bed made with military precision. Books stacked alphabetically. Not a single personal photograph, letter, or memento. In 11 years, Rachel had never seen an inmate with 0 personal items. Even the most hardened prisoners kept something. A child's drawing. A photograph of someone who'd forgotten them. A letter from a lawyer promising appeals that would never come. But Sofia had nothing. Just prison-issued items arranged with obsessive care. Rachel pulled Sofia's file later that night. Read through the case documents. Studied the crime scene photographs. 17 stab wounds. Defensive injuries on the victim's hands suggesting he'd fought back. Blood spatter patterns indicating multiple attack locations throughout the apartment. Neighbors who'd heard shouting but hadn't called police. A history of domestic disturbance calls to that address, each one resulting in no arrests. And buried in the medical examiner's report, a detail that made Rachel's stomach turn. The victim had been alive for most of the attack. The fatal wound had come near the end. Sofia had stabbed him 16 times while he was still conscious. Still fighting. Still able to feel every puncture. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was systematic. Methodical. The work of someone who'd made a decision and followed through with terrifying precision. Rachel closed the file and tried to forget what she'd read. But over the next 3 months, she found herself watching Sofia more closely. Noticing patterns that didn't quite fit. Sofia never went to the yard during recreation time. She stayed in her cell, reading. Never joined groups. Never attended any of the educational programs or therapy sessions unless they were mandatory. And she never, ever spoke unless directly addressed by a guard. Even then, her responses were single words. Yes. No. Understood. It was as if Sofia had decided to become invisible. To serve her sentence as a ghost, taking up space but leaving no impression. And in a prison full of women fighting to be seen, to matter, to maintain some sense of identity against the grinding machinery of incarceration, that choice was radical. The other inmates had theories. Some thought Sofia was undercover law enforcement. Others believed she was witness protection. A few whispered that she was a cartel operative serving time for a hit gone wrong. But none of these theories explained the emptiness in Sofia's eyes. The complete absence of emotion when she moved through the prison like a programmed machine. Rachel had seen broken women before. Women so damaged by life or the system that they'd retreated into themselves. But this was different. Sofia wasn't broken. She was waiting. The question was, waiting for what? The answer came during a riot that started in the cafeteria on a sweltering August afternoon. Temperature over 100 degrees. Tempers already frayed by lockdowns, bad food, guards on power trips. All it took was one spark. An inmate named Crystal Martinez accused another woman of stealing from her commissary account. Words escalated to shoving. Shoving escalated to punches. Within 30 seconds, the entire cafeteria erupted. Inmates fighting each other, overturning tables, smashing trays against walls. Guards calling for backup, deploying pepper spray, trying to contain chaos that spread faster than they could control. Rachel was working the perimeter when she saw Sofia. Still sitting at her corner table. Not participating in the riot. Not trying to escape. Just sitting there, watching everything with those empty eyes. And then Rachel noticed something that changed everything. Sofia was tracking movements with precision. Cataloging which guards responded to which areas. Timing response protocols. Counting seconds between the initial alarm and the arrival of tactical teams. Sofia wasn't just sitting there. She was observing. Studying. Learning. Before Rachel could process what she was seeing, the riot spilled into Sofia's corner. 3 women fighting over a guard's fallen radio crashed into her table. Sofia moved then. Not panicked or defensive. Calculated. She stepped aside at exactly the right moment, let the combatants stumble past her, then calmly walked through the chaos toward the exit designated for lockdown. Rachel lost sight of her in the melee. The riot lasted 17 minutes before tactical teams restored order. 19 inmates went to the infirmary. 7 guards received injuries. 300 women were processed back to their cells, searched, questioned, logged. Sofia returned to her cell without a mark on her. Without a single violation noted in her file. Without saying a word about what she'd seen. That night, Rachel reviewed security footage from the cafeteria. Watched Sofia's movements frame by frame. And realized with cold certainty that Sofia Morales had been waiting for exactly that kind of situation. Testing. Observing. Preparing for something. The question was still the same. Preparing for what? Rachel spent the next 2 weeks trying to convince herself she was imagining things. That stress was making her see patterns where none existed. That Sofia was just another inmate serving time quietly and causing no problems. But the unease wouldn't leave. And when Rachel pulled Sofia's visitor logs, she found something that made her hands shake. In 7 years, Sofia had never had a single visitor. No family. No friends. No lawyer visits after the first year. Nothing. Rachel had processed thousands of inmates. She knew isolation. But this was beyond isolation. This was complete disconnection from the outside world. And for someone convicted of killing their husband, someone who supposedly had no one, that meant Sofia had either alienated everyone in her life or never had anyone to begin with. Rachel accessed the arrest report. Found the investigating officer's contact information. Called him from her personal phone during her off hours. Detective Marcus Rivera answered on the 3rd ring. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd seen too much for too long. Rachel identified herself, explained she was calling about the Sofia Morales case. There was a long pause. Why are you calling about that case? Rivera asked carefully. Just routine follow-up, Rachel lied. Making sure we have accurate records. Another pause. Then, that case was clean. Open and shut. She killed her husband. Jury convicted her. Case closed. I read the file, Rachel said. 17 stab wounds. That's not typical for domestic violence situations. Rivera's tone sharpened. You a detective now, Officer Chen? Or just a corrections guard with too much time on her hands? I'm someone who's been watching an inmate behave in ways that don't match her conviction, Rachel said. And I'm calling because something feels off. She could hear Rivera breathing on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Quieter. Almost sad. You want to know what was off about that case? Everything. The scene was wrong. The evidence was wrong. The timeline was wrong. But the DA wanted a conviction, the community wanted someone punished, and Sofia Morales fit the profile. Poor, immigrant, wrong place at the wrong time. So you think she was innocent? Rachel asked. I think, Rivera said slowly, that I think a lot of things I can't prove. And even if I could prove them, it wouldn't matter. The case is closed. She's serving her time. And the people who really should be in prison are still out there living their lives. What people? Rachel pressed. Rivera sighed. Look, Officer Chen, I'm going to give you some advice. Whatever you think you're investigating, drop it. That case had layers you don't want to dig into. Layers that got buried for a reason. People involved who have long memories and zero tolerance for anyone asking questions. What if I can't drop it? Rachel asked. Then you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of a very dangerous situation, Rivera said. Sofia Morales isn't the only one who pays when people start poking around in things that are supposed to stay buried. You have a career. A life. Don't throw it away for a con who's doing exactly what she's supposed to be doing, serving her sentence quietly. He hung up. Rachel sat in her car in the Irongate parking lot, staring at her phone. Every instinct she'd developed in 11 years of corrections work told her to walk away. To forget this conversation. To go back to treating Sofia Morales like any other inmate. But Detective Rivera's words kept echoing. The people who really should be in prison are still out there. Rachel went home that night and did something she'd never done before. She accessed the dark web using anonymity tools and started searching for anything connected to the Morales case that wouldn't appear in official records. What she found made her blood run cold. Sofia Morales had been married to Detective James Morales. A cop. The case file Rachel had read never mentioned that detail. It listed the victim as James Morales, security consultant. But deeper digging revealed his actual profession. Detective James Morales had been under internal investigation at the time of his death. Multiple complaints of excessive force. Allegations of evidence tampering. Connections to organized crime families operating in the southern border region. His unit had been dirty. And Sofia, his wife, had been in the middle of it. Rachel kept digging. Found sealed court documents. Witness statements that were never presented at trial. And finally, buried in a forum for unsolved crimes, she found a post from an anonymous user written 3 years after Sofia's conviction. The woman who killed Detective Morales didn't do it out of jealousy. She did it because she knew too much. And the people who helped convict her did it to keep her quiet. If she ever talks, a lot of people go down. But she won't talk. She knows what happens to people who talk. Rachel's hands were shaking as she read and reread that post. If it was true, if Sofia Morales wasn't a jealous wife but a witness to police corruption, then everything about her behavior made sense. The silence. The isolation. The careful invisibility. Sofia wasn't broken. She was protecting herself. Because in a system where corrupt cops had reach, even inside prison walls, silence was the only defense. The next morning, during cell inspection, Rachel stood at Sofia's bars longer than necessary. Sofia was sitting on her bunk, reading as always. She didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge Rachel's presence beyond the slightest tensing of her shoulders. Sofia, Rachel said quietly. Sofia's eyes lifted from the page. Met Rachel's gaze for the first time in 7 years. And in that brief moment, Rachel saw something that made her heart skip. Not emptiness. Not defeat. Recognition. Sofia knew that Rachel had figured it out. I need you to trust me, Rachel said. Sofia's expression didn't change. But she gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. And just like that, everything shifted. Rachel had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd acknowledged that she saw Sofia not as an inmate, but as a human being with a story that deserved to be heard. And in a system built on dehumanization, that acknowledgement was radical. Dangerous. Possibly fatal. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the post she'd found. About Detective Rivera's warning. About the implications of what she'd stumbled into. If Sofia Morales was serving time to protect herself from corrupt cops, then helping her meant putting herself in those same crosshairs. But Rachel hadn't become a corrections officer to maintain the status quo. She'd believed, naively maybe, that she could make a difference. That she could help people trapped in a broken system. And now, confronted with someone who was exactly that kind of trapped, Rachel had to decide what her principles were actually worth. The decision came easier than it should have. 3 days later, during a rare moment when Sofia was alone in the library, Rachel approached her with a notepad. "Right," Rachel said. "Everything they don't want anyone to know. Everything that got you convicted. Everything that keeps you silent. Write it down, and I'll make sure someone sees it." Sofia stared at the notepad for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "It's too dangerous," she said. The first complete sentence Rachel had heard from her in 7 years. Her accent was thick but her words were clear. "They will kill you. They will kill anyone who knows." "Who are they?" Rachel asked. Sofia's laugh was bitter. "You already know. The detectives. The prosecutors. The judges. Everyone who had something to lose if I testified about what I saw. What my husband was involved in. What he told me before." She stopped, her hands clenching into fists. "Before you killed him?" Rachel finished. Sofia met her eyes. "Before I defended myself against a man who was trying to silence me permanently. Yes." The truth hung between them like a physical thing. Sofia hadn't murdered her husband in a jealous rage. She'd killed him in self-defense. And the 17 stab wounds weren't evidence of rage, they were evidence of desperation. Of a woman fighting for her life against a man who'd decided she knew too much to live. "Tell me everything," Rachel said. And Sofia, after 7 years of silence, finally spoke. Her husband James had been running protection for a drug trafficking operation that moved product through the southern border. Not small-time dealers. Major cartels with connections to corrupt officials on both sides. James had been on the take for years, using his badge to protect shipments, eliminate competition, intimidate witnesses. Sofia had found out by accident. Found cash hidden in their garage. Followed him one night when he said he was working late. Saw him meeting with people she recognized from news reports about organized crime. She'd confronted him. James had laughed. Said she didn't understand how things worked. Said the money was better than his salary would ever be. Said she should keep her mouth shut and enjoy the benefits. But Sofia couldn't. She was a nurse. She'd seen what drugs did to people. Saw the overdoses, the addictions, the destroyed families. She couldn't pretend she didn't know what her husband was involved in. So she'd gone to James's superior. Filed a complaint. Provided evidence. And waited for the system to work. Instead, the system had turned against her. James's partners covered for him. The evidence disappeared. And her complaint became a problem that needed to be eliminated. James came home one night and told her she'd made a mistake. That she needed to recant her statements. That if she didn't, she'd have an accident. Something tragic. Maybe a break-in gone wrong. Maybe a car crash. But either way, she'd be silenced. Sofia had refused. And James had attacked her with the intent to kill. To make it look like a burglary. To erase the problem she'd become. The 17 stab wounds were Sofia fighting back with the kitchen knife she'd grabbed when James pinned her against the counter. Fighting for her life. Fighting until he stopped moving. Fighting until she was sure she'd survived. But surviving the attack had only been the beginning. The detectives who investigated were James's partners. The evidence was manipulated. Witnesses were coerced. And Sofia's self-defense was twisted into cold-blooded murder. Her court-appointed lawyer had been overworked, underpaid, and outmatched. The jury had seen what the prosecution wanted them to see. And Sofia had been convicted not for what she did, but for what she knew. In prison, she'd stayed silent because talking meant death. Guards could be corrupted. Inmates could be plants. One wrong word to the wrong person, and she'd end up dead in her cell with suicide noted on her death certificate. So Sofia had waited. Served her time. Made herself invisible. And hoped that someday, somehow, the truth would surface without her having to be the one to surface it. When Sofia finished talking, the library was dark. They'd stayed past lockdown. Rachel would have to file a report explaining why an inmate was out of her cell. But none of that mattered compared to what she'd just heard. "I can't prove any of this," Rachel said. "I know," Sofia replied. "That's why I've stayed silent." "But if you're willing to testify." "Against who?" Sofia interrupted. "The detectives who framed me are still working. The prosecutors who convicted me got promotions. The system that buried the truth is still functioning exactly as it did 7 years ago. Nothing has changed except I'm behind bars and they're free." "So you just accept this?" Rachel asked. "Serve your time for a crime you didn't commit." Sofia's smile was sad. "I'm alive. That's more than I would be if I'd stayed quiet outside these walls. At least here, I know who the enemies are. Out there, anyone could be working for them." Rachel wanted to argue. Wanted to say that justice mattered, that truth mattered, that they could find a way to expose the conspiracy. But she'd been in corrections long enough to know that Sofia was right. The system protected its own. And women like Sofia, immigrant women with no resources and no connections, were expendable. "So what now?" Rachel asked. Sofia stuttered her. "Now you forget this conversation. You go back to your life. You protect yourself. Because if you try to help me, they'll destroy you too. And I don't want that on my conscience." "What if I don't want to forget?" Rachel said. Sofia's eyes held something that might have been hope. "Or fear. Or both." "Then you're braver than I ever was." Rachel left the library that night knowing she'd crossed a point of no return. She couldn't unhear Sofia's story. Couldn't pretend she didn't know that an innocent woman was serving 12 years for defending herself against a corrupt cop. Couldn't maintain the comfortable distance that had protected her for 11 years. But she also couldn't help Sofia alone. This required more than good intentions. It required evidence, allies, resources she didn't have. The next 3 days passed in a blur. Rachel worked her shifts, maintained her professional demeanor, and spent every off-hour researching. She contacted journalists who specialized in wrongful convictions. Reached out to civil rights organizations. Tried to find anyone willing to investigate a 7-year-old case involving police corruption. Most didn't return her calls. Those who did were polite but clear. Without new evidence, there was nothing they could do. Sofia's conviction had been clean in procedural terms. Her self-defense claim had been heard and rejected. Overturning it would require proof of misconduct, and that proof had been buried or destroyed years ago. Rachel was running out of options when she received an anonymous email. "You're asking questions about the Morales case. Stop. This is your only warning." The email came from an untraceable address. No signature. No threats beyond the message itself. But Rachel had been in corrections long enough to recognize intimidation when she saw it. Someone was watching. Someone knew what she was doing. And someone wanted her to stop. Rachel should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something else. Determination. Because if someone was trying to scare her off, it meant Sofia's story was true. It meant there were people still protecting the conspiracy that had framed her. And it meant that somewhere, evidence existed that could prove everything. The next morning, Rachel called in sick. Told her supervisor she had food poisoning. Would be out for a couple days. Then she got in her car and drove to the address she'd found in her research. The home of a retired federal prosecutor named Patricia Alvarez, who'd spent 30 years investigating police corruption. Alvarez lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. When she answered the door, Rachel saw a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and an immediately guarded expression. "Patricia Alvarez?" Rachel asked. "Depends on who's asking." Rachel introduced herself, explained she worked at Irongate, and said she needed help with a case involving police corruption and wrongful conviction. Alvarez's expression didn't change, but she stepped aside to let Rachel enter. They sat in a living room filled with boxes of case files and legal documents. Alvarez poured coffee and waited for Rachel to explain. Rachel told her everything. About Sofia. About James Morales and his corruption. About the conviction that was really a cover-up. About the anonymous threats. When she finished, Alvarez was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked one question. "Are you willing to risk everything to help this woman?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted. "But I can't walk away from this." Alvarez nodded. "Good. Because what you're describing isn't just a wrongful conviction. It's a conspiracy involving multiple jurisdictions, active law enforcement, and people with resources to bury anyone who gets in their way. If we pursue this, we need to be smarter than they are, faster than they are, and willing to burn every bridge necessary to get to the truth. Can we do it? Rachel asked. Alvarez's smile was grim. I've done harder. But it requires Sofia's full cooperation. She needs to be willing to testify to everything she knows. Every name, every detail, every piece of evidence she can remember. And she needs to understand that once we start this, there's no going back. For any of us. Rachel nodded. I'll talk to her. But getting Sofia to cooperate proved harder than Rachel expected. When she approached her in the yard during recreation time, Sofia's reaction was immediate and angry. You promised you'd drop this, Sofia hissed, keeping her voice low. You promised you'd protect yourself. I can't, Rachel said. Not anymore. Not knowing what I know. Then you're going to get yourself killed, Sofia said flatly. And I'm going to have to live with that. Oh, Rachel said, we expose them. All of them. And you get out of here. Sofia laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think they'll let me testify? You think they won't kill me the moment they realize what we are trying to do? I've stayed alive for 7 years by being invisible. By being no threat to anyone. The moment I start talking, I become a target again. You're already a target, Rachel said. They know I've been asking questions. Which means they know someone inside talked to me. They're probably watching you right now, waiting to see if you're going to become a problem. Sofia's face went pale. Then you just put me in more danger. No, Rachel said. I gave you a choice. Stay silent and hope they leave you alone. Or fight back and maybe, just maybe, get justice. Sofia stared at her for a long moment. You don't understand what these people are capable of. Then tell me, Rachel said. Tell me everything. Give me enough information that I can build a case even if something happens to you. Make your story matter. And finally, after 7 years of silence, Sofia made a decision. She told Rachel everything. Every detail she could remember. Every name associated with her husband's corruption. Every meeting she'd witnessed. Every conversation she'd overheard. Rachel recorded it all on her phone, hidden in her pocket. Took notes in code that only she could decipher. And over the next 3 weeks, working with Patricia Alvarez, they built a case. But building a case and proving it were two different things. They needed evidence. Physical proof. And all of that had disappeared 7 years ago. Until Alvarez found something buried in old federal case files. A parallel investigation into drug trafficking that had been running at the same time as James Morales' operation. An investigation that had been shut down for reasons the files didn't explain. But buried in those files were surveillance logs, photographs, recordings of phone calls. And in several of those recordings, James Morales' voice could be identified. Discussing shipments. Coordinating with cartel members. Planning operations that resulted in multiple deaths. It wasn't direct evidence of Sofia's case. But it was proof that James Morales had been dirty. And that proof, combined with Sofia's testimony, might be enough to reopen her conviction. Alvarez filed a motion for post-conviction relief. Attached the federal recordings. Submitted Sofia's affidavit. And waited for the legal system to respond. The response came faster than expected. The district attorney's office filed an objection within 48 hours. Argued that the new evidence was irrelevant. That Sofia had been convicted based on physical evidence that was irrefutable. That her claims of self-defense had been thoroughly examined and rejected at trial. But the motion had done something else. It had put Sofia's case in public view. Journalists started digging. Civil rights organizations began asking questions. And slowly, a narrative began to emerge that didn't match the official story. Then the threats escalated. Rachel found her car vandalized in the Irongate parking lot. Slashed tires. Broken windows. A message spray-painted on the hood. Stop. Alvarez received a break-in at her home. Nothing stolen, but her case files had been rifled through. A warning that someone knew what they were doing. And Sofia was attacked in the prison showers. 3 inmates, coordinated, brutal. She survived with broken ribs and a concussion, but the message was clear. Keep talking, and next time she wouldn't survive. Rachel visited her in the prison infirmary. Sofia's face was swollen, her eyes blackened. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I told you this would happen." "I know," Rachel said. "Are you ready to stop?" Sofia asked. Rachel met her eyes. "Are you?" Sofia smiled, and it hurt her split lip. "No. I'm tired of being silent. Tired of being invisible. If they're going to kill me, they're going to have to do it while the whole world is watching." That determination became the foundation of their strategy. Alvarez filed motion after motion, each one attracting more media attention. Rachel gave interviews to journalists, explaining Sofia's case, highlighting the inconsistencies. And Sofia, from inside prison, began writing letters to newspapers, statements to civil rights groups. Her story, told in her own words. The tide began to turn. Public opinion shifted. Questions were raised about the original investigation. And finally, 6 months after Rachel first started asking questions, the FBI opened an investigation into police corruption related to James Morales and his unit. It wasn't exoneration. Not yet. But it was progress. And for the first time in 7 years, Sofia allowed herself to hope. The investigation took 18 months. During that time, Rachel lost her job at Irongate. Was fired for inappropriate involvement with an inmate. Alvarez faced professional censure for her aggressive tactics. And Sofia was moved to protective custody after a second attack, this one resulting in a guard being investigated for facilitating the assault. But the investigation continued. Federal agents interviewed witnesses, reviewed evidence, built a case that exposed the network of corruption that had protected James Morales and his partners. When the indictments came, they were extensive. 7 active officers, 3 retired detectives, 2 prosecutors who'd participated in the cover-up. And the charges ranged from drug trafficking to evidence tampering to conspiracy to commit murder. Sofia's case was reopened. Her conviction was vacated. And after 8 years behind bars for defending herself against a corrupt cop, Sofia Morales walked out of Irongate Women's Correctional Facility a free woman. Rachel was waiting outside the gates. So was Patricia Alvarez. And so were dozens of supporters, journalists, civil rights advocates who'd followed Sofia's case and fought for her release. Sofia stood in the sunlight for the first time in 8 years, blinking back tears. When she saw Rachel, she crossed the distance between them and embraced her. "Thank you," Sofia whispered, "for seeing me when everyone else looked away." Rachel held her, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through. "You taught me what justice really means. Not the kind that follows rules. The kind that demands we stand up even when it costs everything." They stood there for a long moment. Then Sofia pulled back, looked Rachel in the eyes, and spoke words that would define the rest of their lives. "Now we help others. Every woman still inside who's been silenced. Every person trapped by a system that values convictions over truth. We fought for my freedom. Now we fight for theirs." And that's exactly what they did. Rachel and Sofia founded an organization dedicated to wrongful conviction cases, specifically focused on women who'd been convicted for defending themselves against abuse. Patricia Alvarez joined them as legal counsel. And over the next decade, they helped overturn 43 convictions, exposed corruption in multiple jurisdictions, and changed laws that had made it nearly impossible for domestic violence survivors to claim self-defense. Sofia never forgot what silence had cost her. But she also never forgot what breaking that silence had accomplished. And she made it her life's work to ensure that no woman had to choose between invisibility and death. Because in the end, that's what justice required. Not just exposing the guilty, but amplifying the voices of those who'd been forced into silence. Giving them platforms. Giving them support. Giving them the chance to reclaim their stories from the systems that had tried to bury them. The system didn't change overnight. Corruption that deep doesn't disappear just because some people got caught. But cracks formed. Light got through. And in those cracks, other women found hope. Found voices. Found the courage to speak up about what had happened to them. Sofia's case became a precedent. Her story inspired legislation. Her testimony helped convict the people who'd tried to silence her. And her silence, the thing that had been her prison within prison, transformed into the most powerful weapon she possessed. The power to say, "I survived. I fought back. and I refuse to disappear. Years later, standing at a podium in front of lawmakers debating self-defense protections for domestic violence survivors, Sofia thought about the day she'd stopped speaking. The day she'd decided invisibility was survival. She'd been wrong. Invisibility was just another form of death. A slower one, maybe. But just as final. Real survival meant being seen. Being heard. Being believed. Even when the cost was everything. Even when the fight seemed impossible. Even when the system designed to protect you was the same system trying to destroy you. Sofia spoke for 3 hours that day. Told her story without flinching. Described the violence, the corruption, the years of silence. And when she finished, the chamber was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming. Then someone stood and applauded. Then another. Then the entire room. The legislation passed unanimously. And as Sofia left the building, she saw Rachel waiting by the car. Her friend. Her sister in everything but blood. The woman who'd risked her career, her safety, her life to give Sofia a voice when she'd lost the ability to speak for herself. How'd it go? Rachel asked. Sofia smiled. We won. Good, Rachel said. Because we have 17 more cases waiting. Women who need what we needed. People who'll fight for them even when the system won't. They got in the car and drove toward their next case, their next battle, their next chance to turn silence into power. Because that's what justice demanded. Not just one victory. But constant vigilance. Constant resistance. Constant refusal to let the system crush anyone else the way it had almost crushed Sofia. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. But for the first time in her life, Sofia understood that the fight itself was freedom. That speaking truth to power, even when power tried to silence you, was the most radical act possible. She'd been invisible for 8 years. But she would never be invisible again. And neither would the women she helped liberate from their own silences. That was Sofia Morales' legacy. Not the woman who killed her husband. But the woman who refused to let the system define her. Who turned survival into activism. Who transformed her pain into purpose. In a cell in Irongate, a new inmate sat on her bunk, silent and scared. Convicted of killing the man who'd been abusing her. Facing years behind bars for defending herself. A guard approached the bars. Officer Martinez, young, new to corrections, but carrying herself with the confidence of someone who understood what these women had survived. Sofia Morales sent this, Martinez said, passing a book through the slot. Said you might need it. The inmate took the book. It was Sofia's memoir. The Silent Witness, How I Found My Voice Behind Bars. Inside the cover was a handwritten note. Your silence kept you alive. But your voice will set you free. When you're ready to speak, we'll be here to listen. You are not alone. Sofia. The inmate held the book close, and for the first time since her conviction, allowed herself to hope. Because somewhere out there, women who understood were fighting. Women who'd survived were creating paths for others to survive. Women who'd been silenced were amplifying every voice that followed. The system was still broken. Corruption still existed. Women were still being criminalized for defending themselves. But they weren't alone anymore. They had Sofia. They had Rachel. They had an entire network of survivors refusing to let another generation disappear into silence. And that, in the end, was the most powerful form of justice possible. Not the kind that came from courtrooms or legislation, though those mattered. But the kind that came from women looking at each other and saying, I see you. I hear you. I believe you. And I will fight for you even when the world won't. That was Sofia's gift. Born from pain. Forged in silence. Delivered through voices that refused to be quiet. And it was a gift that would echo through every prison cell, every courthouse, every home where women were still fighting to survive. Because Sofia Morales had proven something essential, that invisibility was never safety. That silence was never survival. That real freedom came from speaking truth, even when truth was dangerous. Even when it cost everything. Even when it meant standing against the entire weight of a system designed to crush you. Sofia had done it. Rachel had done it. Patricia had done it. And now, a new generation would do it too. Because that's how justice worked when the system failed. Not through institutions. But through people who refused to look away. Who refused to accept that some lives mattered less than others. Who refused to let convenience triumph over truth. One voice at a time. One case at a time. One woman at a time. Until the silence broke completely. Until every woman behind bars for defending herself found her voice. Until the system finally understood that justice meant protection, not punishment. That survival was not a crime. That fighting back against violence was not murder. Sofia stood in her office, looking at the wall covered with photographs. 43 women whose convictions had been overturned. Dozens more cases in progress. Hundreds of women still inside, waiting for their chance. She picked up her phone and called the next name on the list. "Hello," Sofia said. "My name is Sofia Morales. I heard you need help. Tell me your story. I'm listening." And somewhere in a prison cell, another woman began to speak. The silence was breaking. And this time, it would never return.